So a rotation is a transformation that rotates a figure around a fixed point called the center of rotation. Now let's look at a few examples here. The first one, you can see this is clearly not a rotation. But here you see there is a center of rotation right here, and that looks like about a 90-degree rotation, so that one's good. This one is definitely not a rotation, that's a translation by the looks of it. Okay, now let's rotate a given point 90 degrees about the origin. So let's start with that point and plotting it. Negative 3, 2 is that point right here. Negative 3, 2. And when I say rotate it about the origin is here, isn't it? So if we draw a line, we just have to decide, are we going to rotate that point in a clockwise direction, this way, or in a counterclockwise direction, this way? And the rule in geometry is that you always go counterclockwise unless told otherwise. So we're definitely going to be going this direction, which means this point is going to go from this quadrant here, the second quadrant, to the third quadrant, because that would give us a 90-degree rotation, which means it's going to end up somewhere in this quadrant right here. And what always happens with a 90-degree rotation is we take these two numbers, 3 and 2, and we flip them. So instead of 3 and 2, we get 2 and 3. And now we just have to think, okay, what will give us a number or a coordinate that is in this third quadrant? Well, the only way we can do that is if that 2 was negative and the 3 was also negative. And that gives us our 90-degree rotation point. So let's do exactly the same thing with 1, 4. 1, 4 would put us 1, 4 right here. Okay, there's 1, 4. This one's in the first quadrant, and we're going about the origin again. So we always go counterclockwise, which means we're going to be somewhere over here in the second quadrant. So we follow the same rule. We flip the 1 and the 4, and that becomes 4, 1. And now we just have to figure out, what do we make negative in order to put us somewhere in this quadrant? Well, that would be a negative 4 and a positive 1, and that will give us the answer. Right, same again, negative 2, negative 1, that's here. We go about the origin. It's a 90-degree rotation, always counterclockwise. And that means we're going to be somewhere in here. We do the same trick with these numbers. Instead of 2, 1, we go 1, 2. And now we think, how do we get a number that's somewhere in this quadrant? Well, that would be positive 1, negative 2. So, what's a rule here? Well, let's just take a look at each of these examples. If you look at this right here, we flipped the x and the y, and the y became negative. So this would be negative y, x. That is the general rule for rotations 90 degrees about the origin. Now let's do a 180-degree rotation. So the point we start off with is this one, negative 4, 2, which puts us here. And the way I want you to think about a 180-degree rotation is that it's basically two 90-degree rotations. So a 90-degree rotation would put you here, 180 would put you somewhere over here. And with 90-degree rotations, if you remember, we took this number and we flipped it to 2, 4, but if it's 180, then we're flipping it again, which puts you back in the original setup here. So whatever those numbers are, we're not going to flip them this time. We're going to leave it as 4, 2, and we just need to figure out what will get us into this fourth quadrant. Well, positive 4, negative 2 would stick us in that quadrant. So again, here for a 180-degree rotation, we'll leave the original number orientation, 1, 2, and 1, 2 is here. 180 degrees will put us somewhere down here. Well, how do we get those numbers to put us in the third quadrant? That would be negative 1, negative 2, and that would do it. Okay, same thing here. Leave the original setup, 1 and 3, in the same order. So negative 1, negative 3 is down here. And that would put us, 180 degrees would put us somewhere up here in the first quadrant. So that's just going to be all positive numbers. So what's the general rule here? Well, if you look at each one of these, here and here, what's changing? They're just negating each number. They're leaving the numbers in the same order, and they're just negating them. See how this -4 becomes a 4, the 2 becomes a -2. So this is just -x, -y. Alright, a 270 degree rotation. So let's look at this point right here, 3, -2. 3, -2 is right here. And a 270 degree rotation about the origin, well, that's 90 degrees, that's 180, and that's 270. And I hope you can see that really, all that really is a 90 degree rotation here. I think it's an easier way to think about it, because then all we have to do is, with 90 degree rotations, you remember we take those numbers and we flip them, so we get 2 and 3. Now, what orientation would put us in this quadrant right here? I'm thinking -2, -3 would put us there. Alright, so 4, 1 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. That's here. And again, a 270 degree rotation is 3 90 degree rotations, so it's there, there, and there. So we end up here. But I'm going to do it the easy way and just kind of cheat and say, well, what's a 90 degree rotation that way? We take this number, we flip it to 1, 4, and then we figure out what's got to be negative in order to have this point in this quadrant. And that would be +1, -4. One more time. Take this point, -1, -2, which is here. A 270 degree rotation would go 1, 2, 3. So it's going to put us somewhere in this quadrant. So we're going to take these numbers, we're going to flip them round, and then just figure out what's positive and negative, and the -1 will give us the answer where we need to be. So as a general rule, what's happening with a 270 degree rotation? Well, let's just take a look at this to here. Actually, sorry, I did that wrong. The final answer was this one, wasn't it? So it looks like the x and y are flipping, and the x is becoming negative. So it's y, -x as a general rule. Alright, we are now going to rotate an entire figure 90 degrees. So let's start by plotting each of the points. So you can see here that I've just gone ahead and drawn the shape quickly. Now we've got to do a 90 degree rotation about the origin, and that works exactly the same as we did everything else. The only difference now is we have to pick off the points one at a time. So I'm going to start with this A point, and that A point is this one here, right? It's 2, 2. And a 90 degree rotation would take it from the first quadrant into the second quadrant. And if you recall, for a 90 degree rotation, we flip the numbers. So when we flip 2, 2, we actually get 2, 2. And how do we get the 2, 2 that puts us in the second quadrant? Well, that would be a -2 and a +2. So this A point is going to go right here, and that will be my A prime. Now let's do the same with this B point. Well, we're going to flip it. So instead of 3, 2, we get 2, 3. And B right here is in the fourth quadrant. So if we're going to rotate that 40 degrees, that will put us in the first quadrant. So that's actually going to be our B prime point, which is 2, 3. So B prime goes here. And then finally for the C, again we switch it. Instead of 4, 2, we're going to go 2, 4. And since C is in this quadrant, if we're going to go counterclockwise, that would put us in the third quadrant. So how do we get a third quadrant point out of this? Well, that would have to be -2, -4. So -2, -4 is right here. So that's C prime, and now we just join up all our points that we just came up with. Okay, let's try and do that for a 270 degree rotation. So again, here is my original shape, and we're going to do a 270 degree rotation about the origin. So let's pick them off one point at a time. Now, 270 degree rotation if we're looking at point A right here, 270 degrees would take you from the first quadrant to the second quadrant to the third quadrant to the fourth quadrant. So we want to be somewhere in the fourth quadrant for that A point. And basically I'm just going to make it easy for myself. Instead of going 3 times counterclockwise, I'm just going to go a 90-degree rotation clockwise, because that's the same as 270 degrees. And so I take my A point, which is here, 2, 2, I flip it, which gives me 2, 2, and I think, what would put me in the fourth quadrant with those numbers? It would be 2, negative 2. So A prime is going to be 2, negative 2. That would put me right here. A prime. Okay, we do the same thing for B. Okay, again, we're going to rotate, instead of 270 counterclockwise, I'm going to cheat and go 90 degrees clockwise, which means this B point right here is actually going to end up in this quadrant here. We flip the numbers, we go 2, 3, and to be in the third quadrant, you need a negative 2 and a negative 3. So negative 2, negative 3. There's my B prime. And then for C, same thing. Instead of doing 270 degrees counterclockwise, I'm going to go 90 degrees clockwise, which is actually going to put me in the first quadrant. So I'm just going to switch those numbers. Instead of 4, 2, I'm going to go 2, 4. And 2, 4 would put me right there. So that's C prime. So now I just join them all up. And I get my new shape. I think you've seen enough examples. I'm just going to let you go attack your homework now.